Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of What's Going On, and I'm your host, Tom D'Ambra. We thank you very, very much for taking your time to spend with us. We were thinking, folks, that this is our fifth show, and we'd like to do a real quick and very brief overview of some things that we've determined so far. We have used case history, we have used case law, and we have used documentation and quotes from different parties of the times, depending on what event we were speaking of. So everything that we have presented to you so far has been documented from many, many sources. As abstract as some of this information may seem to you, it is, again, all documented and written in truth. So one of the big things that we want to make sure that everybody understands, just in case you weren't able to see any of our previous shows, is that the Federal Reserve Bank, as we know it, the name was put in deceitfully by a gentleman by the name of Paul Warburg. He wanted to use the word federal, so in fact that people would think that it was part of the federal government, which it's not. And also he wanted to use the word reserves because they knew all along from the beginning of this act, which by the way was put in on December 23rd, 1913, while the Congress was away for the Christmas holiday. They knew they were going to confiscate all the gold and silver from the nation, and they wanted to use the word reserve so that people would believe that, in fact, there was a reserve being put aside, and they didn't mind giving up all their gold and silver. We also got into how this is literally a cartel. We also got into the fact of who was financing and who was the orchestrators, who was the liaisons between the different international parties, and how they all met at Jekyll Island. Senator Nelson Aldrich, who later went on to marry in the Rockefeller family, as in David Aldrich Rockefeller, and how he was the liaison between the two major banking entities, particularly the Rothschilds and Warburgs out of England and Germany, respectively, and how they coordinated this effort at Jekyll Island, how it was done through the cloak of darkness, how it was done in secrecy, and how they even went about using just first names and or different names. It was a fabrication of, they were all getting together to go on a duck hunting trip. And so what came out of the Federal Reserve, again, it was a private foreign bank that wound up going over to take control of the money system of the United States, when Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution mandates that only the Congress may have control of the issuance and value thereof of our currency. So, and then we also got into, in fact, of some of the events that have taken place since then. We got into how the Great Depression, how they orchestrated that, and what means they had used available to them, and what their ultimate goals were. And we're going to review just a couple of things that I've gone through so far. One of the things is we've used the word cartel. And so I'd like to read from you exactly what is a cartel. When you look into these people, you'll understand that they worked in unison of together. They were previously competitors. They finally understood to themselves that, hey, if we're gonna pull this off, there's a big enough pie for all of us to get a good piece of it. And you and I are the pie, by the way. So let's get an understanding of what a cartel is. A cartel is a group of independent businesses which join together to coordinate the production, pricing, and marketing of their members. The purpose of a cartel is to reduce competition and thereby increase profitability. This is accomplished through a shared monopoly over their industry, which forces the public to pay higher prices for their goods or services than would be otherwise required under a free enterprise competition. So I think that definition sums it up quite well. You could have a cartel in the automobile industry, you could have a cartel in the shoe industry, or you could have a cartel in the banking industry, which is what our lives are controlled by right now. But some things that should come out to you about this: number one, it's an independent business, okay? It's not working for you and I, it's working for their own goals. And they join together in a coordinated effort to control the production, pricing, and marketing of their members, of their industry. Again, whether it be shoes, tires, automobiles, or money. And of course, and the reason why they do this, the cartel's purpose is to reduce competition and therefore increase profitability. And they have basically squashed any banking competition that they have pretty much throughout the world. But particularly here in the United States, every bank that you deal with, I can only think of two right now off the top of my head that are not part of the Federal Reserve banking system, and they are all part of a Native American enterprise. When you get back into the legalities of our founding era, the Indians were not considered American citizens, and so they did not have these so-called rights, but they also did not have these obligations. So they were able to go outside the private banking cartel that we know as the federal banking, as a Federal Reserve, and open up their own bank. And in another show, we're actually going to have some currency from them to demonstrate to you, number one, that their money is of hard value. It is backed by silver. So they accomplished this through a shared monopoly over their industry, which forces the public to pay higher prices for their goods or services than would otherwise be required under a free enterprise competition. So what industry are we talking about? Obviously, we're talking about the banking industry, the money industry. And we'll go back to one of the earlier shows where we talked about Emma Rothschild talking about, give me control over a nation's currency. I care not who makes its laws. And this is why, folks, these crazy contracts that we have like NAFTA and GATT and CAFTA and the rest of these free trade agreements, they always put these really nice words to them, a free trade agreement. Well, actually, folks, there's nothing, it is 22,000 pages of free trade agreement. I mean, if it was an open market free trade, would you need 22,000 pages of legislation and or rules and bylines and guides to control this? No, it would be what's really termed a laissez-faire market. It would be open. You wouldn't have all these crazy folks. When you study some of these documents, not that I have studied all the 22,000 pages, but I have read summaries of them. We actually finance these manufacturing companies to move overseas. They get tax incentives to take their manufacturing base and move it out of the country. Now, the politicians that supposedly serve us, are they looking out for our well-being? Obviously not. What they're looking out for, their well-being, is the people who really control the scenes. And other shows we've gotten into, and this is, again, a quote from Anthony Sutton, Warburg's revolutionary plan to get American society to go to work for Wall Street was astonishingly simple. Even today, academic theocrats cover their blackboards with meaningless equations, and the general public struggles in bewildered confusion with inflation and the coming credit collapse. While the quite simple explanation of the problem goes undiscussed and almost entirely uncomprehended. The Federal Reserve System is a legal private monopoly of the money supply operated for the benefit of the few under the guise of protecting and promoting the public interest. Does that not sum that up so well? Like I said, study Anthony Sutton. He's tremendously on the ball with what's going on. But let me read the last caption again. The Federal Reserve System is a legal private monopoly of the money supply operated for the benefit of the few under the guise of protecting and promoting the public interest. Again, folks, always for your own good. We're doing this for you. We just made you pay $14.8 trillion to these very same people for your own good. Okay? Now, I heard an interesting statistics this week. Actually two that really rocked the boat with me. One of them was that $9.3 trillion would have paid off all the mortgage debt in this country. Now, we gave them $14.8, so they still would have had $5.5 trillion, and they could have paid off all the mortgage. They really wanted to help out the economy, help out the people, free up the currency to where, in fact, take the burden away from debt off the people. They got the money anyway. They created the money out of thin air, as we have demonstrated time again on this show. All they had to do was pay the $9.3 trillion, which they got anyway. They could have wiped the slate clean for everybody. And think what that would have done to the economy. Think of think of the cash infusion that would have brought into the economy. Think of how that would have stimulated growth. Entrepreneurs would have had money freed up. They would have had credit freed up, to go into the task at hand. Again, if we had a laissez-faire economy. We do not have a laissez-faire economy. So, cui bono? Who benefited from this so-called bailout? Now you have GM and Chrysler and all these receiving all this money. Folks, GM is just merely shutting down North American operations. If you do the research again, you'll find out they've built new plants in Vietnam. Boy, good thing we went to war with them people for 16 years to stop communism, huh? They're building, their headquarters is going to be based in Brazil. They've built new plants in China. Folks, they're just shutting down North American operations. It's no longer cost effective to do business here. The currency's been devalued. The government is squishing them with, all these different alphabet agencies they have to follow. The tax rates are some of the highest in the nation. And they also know the people are being starved. And I mean financially, the people don't have the credit anymore. Oh, the credit's not out there. We're going to give all this money so we can loosen the credit markets. They haven't loosened the credit markets. Do the research, folks. They've taken your money, and we're going to get into what is money, but they've taken this asset, if you would, and they have purchased strong banks with them, banks that were in good standing. They didn't bail out banks. They purchased good standing in order banks with this money. No accountability, and all the money has been allowed to move offshore. So, Mr. Warburg, again, is another quote. Paul N. Warburg is probably the mildest-mannered man that ever personally conducted a revolution. It was a bloodless revolution. He did not attempt to rouse the populace to arms. He stepped forth armed simply with an idea, and he conquered. That's the amazing thing. A shy, sensitive man, he imposed his idea on a nation of over 100 million people. And that same idea is still being orchestrated on a nation of 300 million people today. So, very, very interesting. When you look back at how this all took place, like I said, I want to do a little bit of a review here. And another quote here. We're going to get into money now. What is money and what is not money, okay? So, with that being said, let's go to our law dictionary. This is Black's 4th Law Dictionary. I highly recommend, folks, if you really want to get into the language and the terminology. A lot of times, folks, things you may think one word is something else that it's not, all right? And let me see what would be I'm going to give you a good example right here. What we think a person is. Very interesting. What a person, everyone thinks of a person, simply as a man or a woman. But a person, when you really get down to it, literally means a corporation. A person is a corporate entity. I've gone into court years ago before I understood what they were talking about, and there was a woman, and she said to the judge numerous times, I am not a person. I am not a person. And I found this interesting because I'm thinking, boy, I see a woman standing in front of me, on 2 legs and breathing air and all the rest of that goes along with making up a physical person. The word person in its natural and usual signification includes a woman as well as man. The term in law includes artificial beings such as corporations. Okay? The term includes artificial beings such as corporations, and that's Black's 4th, page 1299. Okay? So I want you to think about this. This is just one small example. You go into a court and you say that, I'm a person. Well, the judge knows you're speaking legalese now. You may be ignorant of the fact you're speaking legalese, but the judge is going to take your being a person as a corporate entity. In law, it's called a nom de guerre, and we'll get into that at some point. But you got to understand that language is everything with these people, and all the language is based on deception. Look at the word code. Whenever you see the word code, folks, you got to understand 2 things about it. One, it comes from the Latin word coda, which means to be secretly altered. And then second, it also means code means you're into a commercial venue of law. The IRS code, the Uniform Commercial Code. Okay, let's take the Uniform Commercial Code. Uniform, all being equal, all being the same. Venue of law, commercial. Code, altered secretly under a commercial venue. So when you see UCC, Uniform Commercial Code, that should tell you, number one, what venue of law you're under, and number two, that you better start looking up the language being used because it's not the general acceptance of the word. Again, person being a fine example of that. Now, let's get back to money. Again, this is Black's Law Dictionary, page 4th edition, 1157, okay? In its usual and ordinary acceptance, it means gold, silver, or paper money used as circulating medium exchange and does not embrace notes, bonds, or evidence of debt or of personal real estate. Let me read that again and think of what I'm reading to you, okay? In its usual and ordinary acceptance, it means gold, silver, or paper money used as a circulating medium of exchange and does not embrace notes, bonds, or evidence of debt. Do you remember the last show? We took the silver certificate, which had intrinsic value, and we took what we use today, which is a Federal Reserve note. What is a note? A note is an acknowledgement of debt, okay? You labor, you work, you judge your life by a worthless piece of paper, by an acknowledgement of debt, all right? Think of what I'm saying. By the definition of money, we do not have money. What we do have is legal tender, and that's why it says right on the note, legal tender. It doesn't say certificate, because if it said certificate, it means it would be redeemable for some intrinsic value. Are you following me here? Okay. We work for a legal tender instrument of debt of a private foreign corporation. That's what we base our lives on. So what happened to all the money that we really had? This country had real money at one time. Again, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, Congress regulates the value thereof, must be based on intrinsic value. Clause 10 must be based on intrinsic value of gold and or silver. What happened to that money? We have no money. What happened to it? This cartel that we know as the Federal Reserve has taken it all. Okay. So now that we're clarified on what we have and what we don't have, folks, do you remember a couple of shows ago we got into the coinage, different coinage acts of the country, and we read verbatim actually what a dollar is. Let's do this again. A dollar equals 25.8 grains of gold and a 15-to-1 ratio of silver. Do you have money? No. You have worthless instruments of debt in your pocket, and this is what you base your life on. You've got to get an understanding of where we are, okay? And the more worthless money they print out, the less value it has. And this is what inflation is. Inflation is not this. So let's say that this 1950, this cup cost 50 cents, okay? This cup probably costs $5 today. Okay? It's not that the value of that cup has changed. What's changed is the value of the medium of exchange. The going from money, which had intrinsic value, to legal tender, which is completely fiat of no value. Okay? So when said, oh my God, the price of the house now is $300,000, but back in 1964, you paid $14,000 for it. Why? 1964, we still had some silver capacity to our money. There was still some kind of a backing, okay? And JFK made sure of that. John Kennedy, he audited Fort Knox, found out there was no gold, found out there was $4.2 trillion worth of, actually I have the exact quote right there, worth of silver, and he issued silver certificates. If you remember a couple of shows ago, we actually held one out and you could read the language on it. Again, that was real money. Now we have legal tender. Very important that you understand that. Okay. So, this is a quote from Walter Kristen, he was in the bank, president of Citicorp Bank in 1982. And now he's sort of bragging here, folks, so bear with me. If we had Truth in Government Act comparable to the Truth in Advertising law, every note issued by the Treasury would be obliged to include a sentence saying, this note will be redeemed with the process from an identical note which will be sold to the public when this one done comes due. In other words, there's nothing here. There's nothing here. What he's telling you is that for every one of these Federal Reserve notes that are in circulation, there is an interest, a bond due on it. How do you ever get out of debt? How do you pay off the interest? Because if you create that asset to pay off the interest from this one, well, you just went in more debt for the interest to pay off the one that you had to pay off originally. It's called perpetual debt, okay? With this system, you're not going to get out of debt as a nation or even as a person. Because for every, don't want to use the word dollar, for every Federal Reserve note you have in your pocket, there is an interest due on that. So it's all based on debt, every bit of it. Now he's bragging a little bit here. This is within close quarters, and he's bragging a little bit here. But again, you know, it hits home where we are. Okay. So some of the things that go on today, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you know, said it very well that, you know, nothing in politics happens by chance. Okay. You know, folks, I find it interesting that 2 or 3 years ago, while the dollar, what we call the dollar, is being devalued and the economy's going into a free fall, you know, I found it interesting that the Congress of the United States spent $124 million to see if some highly overpaid brat baseball players are using steroids or not. Think of that. They knew the economy was in free fall. They know the devaluation of the currency. They know the war is being expanded. And what did they take their time and efforts and energy on? To find out if some $1 million baby is using steroids or not. Why wasn't that left up to the game of baseball to take care of their own house? Why? The whole thing was a diversion. What did the people talk about for 6 months? Oh, whether A-Rod or whether whoever, Canseco, whoever is using steroids. Who cares? Do you really care? Is that going to affect your pocketbook and your children's future? Absolutely not. If you don't want to watch baseball with guys using steroids, turn the TV off. Don't go to the ball game. If you don't mind it, keep watching the game and go to the ball game. But it should not be a thing of such interest to the Congress of the United States. It was merely a diversion, folks. Keep you looking over here and not over here where the real problem is. Okay? And then they come out and say, oh, we were caught by surprise with this. They weren't caught by surprise on this. These people aren't stupid. They know who the players are, and they play right along with them. Okay. So let's get into Zabrinsky. He was a national security advisor to Jimmy Carter. Folks, if you really want to study what these wars are about, you got to read this man's book, All the World is a Chess Game. Incredible. This book was written before we went into Afghanistan, before we went into Iraq, and he plays this whole thing out. He is one of the top players here, okay? He was a founding member of the Trilateralist Commission. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he attends every Bilderberg meeting since the 70s. One of the top players. And, you know, these people are very egotistical. They do like to speak of their deeds and what they have planned and show how it's done. And I also, in listening to Lindsey Williams, as he says, he got to rub shoulders for 3.5 years with people that he didn't believe prior existed. So rather interesting, as he calls them the elite of the world. But he made an interesting quote, and the quote was this, that these people, yes, they're in control of your lives, but they for whether religious meanings or whatever, I don't understand the reason why, but they feel obligated in one way or another to tell you what they're going to do. Now, a lot of times they do it through Hollywood, and I could go on with a lot of different things about that with regards to, a movie coming out here and then 2 years or 2 months later the event takes place, and 9/11 comes to mind when I say that. But they feel obligated to tell the people what they're going to do. It's all done in secrecy, and you have to read between the lines to get there, okay? But they do feel obligated to do it, and again, they're very egotistical, okay? So they like spreading their manure, as I like to say. But let's listen to Zabrinsky here. Some international cooperation has already been achieved, but further progress will require greater American sacrifices. Now, you think the American sacrifices are going to be on the elite? No, you and I, okay? More intensive efforts to shape a new world monetary structure will have to be undertaken, with some consequent risk to the present relatively favorable American position. That was in 1970. What was going on in 1970? Vietnam was hot and heavy, a lot of turmoil in the country. They were turning things over, okay? Now, listen to this. National economies need monetary coordination mechanisms, and that is why an integrated world economy needs a common monetary standard. But no national currency will do. Only a world currency will work. Folks, this is the reason why they got the euro. And now, because nobody wants what we call the dollar overseas, we are paying off foreign debts with an instrument called the Amero. Gee, wonder who developed that. Of course, we talked about it in earlier shows. The average American hasn't even heard of the Amero, and here we are paying off foreign debts to it. My brother had a friend whose ancestry comes from Portugal. Last summer, he went to Portugal, but anyway, he had to fly through Madrid, and he's in Madrid, and he wants to get a taxi cab. So he gets the taxi cab, long story short, and he goes to pay the man with a $20 American bill. Folks, the taxi cab driver in Madrid would not accept the $20 American currency. He actually offered the taxi cab driver another $20 just to take the currency. The taxi cab driver wouldn't take it. He's been under orders not to take American money. Okay? It's devaluing, folks. The more they print, the more of it, the less value it has. We're going to get into, probably next week, we're going to get into Germany. 1930, I have a thing of saying it. Right now, folks, we are 1933 Germany, and I want to explain next week why. But when you understand what happened to their currency by the same players, by the same people who are controlling our currency today, what's that old saying Churchill had? Those that don't know history are bound to repeat it. Well, here we are. Okay, so again, this is Richard N. Cooper, another CFR member. Okay, and this is at a closed door meeting with the CFR, how they're going to come about doing this with the currency. I suggest a radical alternative scheme for the next century, where we are today. The creation of a common currency for all of the industrial democracies with a common monetary policy and a joint bank issue to determine the monetary policy. How can independent states accomplish that? They need to turn over the determination of a monetary policy to a supranational body. Who do you think the supranational body is? Okay? It is highly doubtful whether the American public, to take just one example, could ever accept that countries with oppressive autocratic regimes should vote on the monetary policy that would affect the monetary conditions in the United States. For such a bold step to work at all, it presupposes a certain convergence of political values. In short, the house of world order will have to be built from the bottom up. An end round to national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, will accomplish much more than old-fashioned frontal assault. And again, folks, that's exactly what I'm talking about earlier with the Hegelian dialect. They've gotten way beyond the barrel of a gun. It's going to come down to the barrel of a gun to maintain their status quo once the American people get topsy-turvy and turmoil because of the fact that they're losing their homes, they can't feed their children, their currency is devalued. Okay, that's all going to take place. It's in the plans. I'm not predicting anything. I'm just telling you what they're writing. Okay, so when we get into inflation, let me just give you a quote from Thomas Jefferson, 1786. Everyone through whose hands a bill is passed. Now you got to understand at this time, we're using something like you would call script, okay? Whose hands a bill is passed, lost on that bill what it lost in value during the time it was in his hands. This was a real tax on him. And in this way, the people of the United States actually contributed to those millions of dollars during the war, and by a mode of taxation, the most oppressive of all because the most unequal of all. Inflation affects the poor, the lower on the economic scale of status that a person may be, the greater detrimental effect inflation has on a person. Okay? You got to understand that. Okay. So, let's get into a little bit now. We could get into some of the what's called the natural laws of money. Fiat money is paper money without precious metal backing, and which people are required by law to accept it. Let me just stop. Let me stop there. Is that not where we are today? Fiat money is paper money without precious metal backing, and which people are required by law to accept it. That's what you have in your pocket today. And you can go ahead and put that Federal Reserve note in the bank, right? And you can collect, I don't care, 2-3%. I don't really care how much the value they're going to give it to you. But you might as well not put it in the bank, because I'm going to tell you the reason why. One, they can keep you from possessing it at any point, which history shows they've done 3 times in this country, okay? And two, because of the rate of inflation in this country, they'd have to give you probably 10-20% interest just to stay level. So why would you risk putting something in a place that you can't always have access to it, and you're losing value of it while it's sitting there? Doesn't make sense. Think about what you're doing, okay? And then because we're under a fractional banking system, in other shows we get into how we're under a 2% fractional banking system. We use the quote from Alan Greenspan during Y2K. We estimate that only 2% of the American people are going to take their money out of the bank. Yeah, you know why? You know why he knew that figure? Because we're on a 2% fractional banking system. For every dollar that is lent out, for every dollar in asset, there's only 2 cents backing it up. So, of course, only 2% of the American people are going to get their money out. That's all that's there, okay? You put money in the bank, folks, they put it on their banks as an entry, and they lend off of that. That's how they do it. The money is created through debt in this country. Remember that, because it gets very, very technical. It allows politicians to increase spending without raising taxes. Fiat money is the cause of inflation, and the amount which people lose in their purchasing power is exactly the amount which was taken from them and transferred to their government by this process. Inflation, therefore, is a hidden tax. This tax is the most unfair of all because it falls most heavily on those who are least able to pay, the small wage earner and those on fixed income. It also punishes the thrifty by eroding the value of their savings. This creates resentment among the people, leading the way always to political unrest and national disunity. A nation that resorts to the use of fiat money has doomed itself to economic hardship and political disunity. And folks, history shows this. I ask you to name one fiat currency that has survived the test of time. There's not one. There's not one. We can go from the Byzantines, we can go from the Romans, we can go from the Greeks, we can go from the Germans, we can go from the Italians. There's not one. And now we can go to the Americans, because that's what's going on right now. Okay? That's why the foreigners who know more about what's going on in this country than the average American will not accept our money anymore. And that's why we're using another monetary unit called the Amero that the American people on average don't even know about. Again, it's all done in secrecy. Okay? So, with this cartel, what did they actually want to do? Okay? There was some things that they wanted to do. Number one was the government would grant a charter to the. This is coming out of London, by the way, folks. This is what the cabal met at Mercer's Chapel in London, and this is when they were coordinating. Okay, we're going to put this together. Just what are we looking to do here? Okay, the government would grant a charter to the monetary scientists to form a bank. Now remember, they didn't want to use the word bank, and they didn't. The bank would be given a monopoly, big word here, okay, to issue banknotes which would circulate as paper currency. Again, notes, acknowledgement of debt, taking away intrinsic value from the currency. The bank would create money out of nothing with only some very famous quotes by some very, very powerful inside people that who really controls the system. You know, Barack Obama, he's just another puppet of a different shade, folks. The American people have got to learn to look up at the string holders and not the puppets that are presented to them. And we also, I think it was the last show, we got into a bit about the Republican and Democratic parties. They both work for the same entity. There's no difference between the two. They may throw these little diversion acts. Oh, you know, one's conservative and one's liberal, one's left, one's right, one's pro-choice, one's pro-life. Meaningless diversions is what they are. And I think it was Lenin that said it the best, that, you know, we must make use of our useful idiots. The useful idiots were the people that were serving them. At that time, he was speaking of the local magistrates, the politicians of the day at local and state levels, and also the big thing he was talking about was the security forces or police forces that, you know, that carried out their agenda. Excuse me. So let's get an understanding of what a cartel is and the reasoning for it, why they're actually, why they have them. Now, we did mention Paul Warburg earlier. And Mr. Warburg was, like we said in other shows, he was the father, of the Federal Reserve System. We also got into some of the things of why they didn't want to use the word banking and how they had to make the American people believe that, and you know, the impression that they were actually against this reserve, this banking system, when in actuality, folks, they were pushing behind the scenes to get this adopted. They, you know, we got into the Hegelian dialect, how they create the crises to get the reaction from you to warrant their means. So, you know, that's what they do. They'll create these crises, whether it's the war on poverty, the war on drugs, the war on alcohol, the war on terrorism, whichever it may be. All the ones that I have just mentioned, they create the crises. Now, you may say, well, how do they create the drug war? Folks, we're going to get into this in another show in great depth. But the let me back up a little bit and qualify what I'm saying. There was an FBI agent by the name of Ted Gunderson, and he was one of the leading investigators for the FBI. And Ronald Reagan took him and said, listen, I want to find out where this cocaine is coming from. It's a menace to my country. You're going to answer to me and Al Haig only. You're not going to go through the bureaucratic process. You're going to answer to me and Al Haig, who at the time was Secretary of State. So after about a little less than a year, about a 10-month investigation with all the assets made available to him, Mr. Gunderson went back to Ronald Reagan and said, you know, Ronald Reagan said, okay, you know, Ted, what have you discovered? You know, what's going on? How can we stop this? What's the source of this problem? Ted Gunderson's words, and I quote him, were, Mr. President, the United States government is the biggest drug dealer in the world. Now, when we do our shows on the war on drugs and so forth, we're going to have that quote for you, but that is verbatim. That is literally the quote that he said, because them words have stuck in my ear since I read this 15 years ago. Mr. President, the United States government is the biggest drug dealer in the world. And then we can get into the Iran-Contra, where they were bringing in, through the CIA, they were bringing in drugs into a place called Mena, Arkansas. George Bush was in charge. George Bush Sr., number 41, was in charge of the operation. And, of course, there was a governor of Arkansas at that time, happened to be the future president, what a coincidence, a gentleman by the name of Bill Clinton. So, you know, this is what they do, folks. It's just like with the Prohibition. You know, they had 14 years of Prohibition. We got to do something about drinking. So what they do, that was to create the crisis to get a federal agency involved in the states, because the Constitution forbids the federal government from being involved in law enforcement. And they're only supposed to be involved in law enforcement in territories, districts, and enclaves, not in the Union, not in the states. So what they had to do, they created a crisis. We got to have a war on the drinking. They got the reaction from the people they wanted. They implemented Prohibition. They brought in what's today known as the ATF. Okay. Well, when they did away with prohibition, did they do away with the ATF? No. The ATF's budget has expanded and expanded every budget since. So again, this is what they do. In 1964, we had to have the war on poverty. Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was president of the United States, what he'd do, now we're going to redistribute your wealth. And I remember his words being that we're going to take from the haves and give to the have-nots. Well, folks, who are the haves and who are the have-nots? We've got over $4 trillion involved in the welfare system in this country, and now more people are in poverty today than ever. And some of it is the fault of the welfare system itself, because the more money you print out, the more food stamps you print out, the more of these commodities that there are, the less value they have. So what takes place is the hidden tax known as inflation. So again, keep that in mind when you see these kind of events taking place. Now then you may say, well, what about the war on terror? We didn't create the war on terror. Well, I will tell you folks that if you really believe that 19 hijackers outsmarted and outwitted the entire United States DOD, Department of Defense, all the Pluto of intelligence agencies that we have, and if you think they really carried this off without any inside help, then you have got to do some reading and some research. You've got to turn off your television, and you have got to do some research as to the reality of what's going on. Coming up in the month of August and into September, folks, we are going to do 2 shows specially dedicated to 9/11, the events thereof. And I think you're going to find, this is all going to be footage, this is all going to be newsreels, this is all going to be quotes from the people that were there. And I think you're going to find it very, very shocking, but I don't want to go on too much about that. But let me say this. 9 of the 19 hijackers have been confirmed alive. I have interviews with 7 of them. So please keep that in mind. But again, that's what they do. Create the crisis, warrant the means to get the reaction that they want from you so they can present themselves as the saviors. And it's the same thing with the money. It's the same thing with these bailouts we're having now. Nothing's different. I forget who said the quote. I think it might have been John Adams, but it was one of the founding fathers, and he said, necessity is the cry of a tyrant. We have to do this. This is always for your own good. We have to have the war on drugs. We have to have the war on drinking. We have to have the war on poverty. Now we have the war on terrorism. Always for your own good. And I ask you folks, qui bono? Who benefits? Are you benefiting from the war on terrorism? No. As a matter of fact, if you read the legislation now, you're the terrorist. Are you a veteran? You're a terrorist. Are you a homeschooler? You're a terrorist. Okay? Do you have more than 30 days worth of food in your house? You are a terrorist. Are you a gun owner? You're a terrorist. Are you a constitutionalist? You are a terrorist. So this whole thing has been geared to you. And again, we're going to get into that in later shows. I don't want to digress too much away from what we're talking about right now. But again, just keep that in mind. The Hegelian dialect, problem, reaction, solution. So now, Mr. Warburg, as we said, is the founder of the father, if you would, of the Federal Reserve System. So I wanted to do a little quote here from Anthony Sutton. Anthony Sutton was a former research fellow at Hoover Institute for War, Revolution, and Peace. He's also a professor of economics, was a professor of economics at California State University in Los Angeles. And I will tell you, folks, if you really want to get into the funding of wars through Wall Street, I ask you to read Anthony Sutton's book. One of them that jumps right out at me is Hitler and Wall Street. And when you read this book and you get into the funding, how the Brown Brothers Harriman out of the Union Bank out of New York, how they funded the Third Reich, how they funded Adolf Hitler, how it was funded from the Union Bank into the Reich Bank of National Reich Bank of Germany. And when you go and research this and you find out that the fund manager between the two banks, between the Union Bank of New York and the Reich Bank of Germany, was none other than the grandfather of the former President George Bush. Prescott Bush was the fund manager between the people who financed Hitler and Hitler himself. And we'll get into that at some point. But back to Mr. Warburg. Only a fraction of its total currency backed by coin, 2%, is where we are today. The monetary scientists would then loan the government all the money it needed. But think of it. Is it money from the definition in Black's Law, no, it's not money. It's created out of thin air. So all your labors and all this, it's not for money, folks. This is for legal tender. This is for some, this is for a piece of paper that someone put some fancy engraves on, and somebody with a barrel of a gun says you have to use for currency, for an exchange of medium. That's all it is. The money created for the government loans will be backed primarily by government IOUs. Boy, how far have we traveled along that road? Although this money listen to these words. Although this money will be created out of nothing and would cost nothing to create, the government will pay an interest of 8%. The government IOUs would also be considered as reserves for the creating of additional loan money for private commerce. These loans would also earn interest. Think of that. Okay? They create it out of nothing, and then they put it on their books as an asset so they can get more currency. Okay? In short, since there are not enough private savers willing to finance the deficit, this group will graciously be willing to buy government bonds, provided that they do so with newly created, out-of-thin-air banknotes carrying a raft of special privileges. Now, you think the special privileges are for you and I? I don't think so. Okay? I don't believe it, folks. And now this is from the congressional record, and we talked about how they create money with debt. First of all, let's get into this is an exchange. This is real quick between a gentleman named Ackles and a congressman named Patman. Okay, they're talking about the purchasing of $2 billion of government bonds. This is in 1933, and like we talked about in 1933, our corporation that we call the government went bankrupt to these very same people. Okay, so Patman is asking them how they're doing this, and Ackles responds, "We created." Patman, says, "Out of what?" Ackles responds, "Out of the right to issue credit money." Patman, "And there is nothing behind it? Is there, except our government's credit?" Ackles, "That is what our monetary system is. If there were no debts in our monetary system, there wouldn't be any money. Money is debt based on debt, and that's why they took the $14.8 trillion, bought up all these positive, good standing assets, and left the debt, the $9.3 trillion of the mortgage, to the people, to you, to carry and burden." Now, Robert Hampel, credit manager of the Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta. Again, they're very egotistical people, but listen to this. This is Mr. Hampel. Now, again, you think this man would know something about it. He's the credit manager of the Federal Reserve Bank. You think he understands something about how the monetary system's working? If all the bank loans were paid, no one could have a bank deposit, and there would not be a dollar of coin or currency in circulation. This is a staggering thought. We are completely dependent on the commercial banks. Someone has to borrow every dollar we have in circulation or credit. If the banks create ample synthetic money, we are prosperous. If not, we starve. We are absolutely without a permanent money system. When one gets a complete grasp of the picture, the tragic absurdity of our hopeless situation is almost incredible, but there it is. That, folks, from Mr. Robert Hampel, credit manager of the Federal Reserve banking system. You think he may know a little bit about what's going on. Debt. The entire function of this machine is to convert debt into money. Now think of that. Debt on a sheet is a negative. This whole thing is to take this negative and turn it into a positive. To create nothing into something. Take something fiat, even though it's a negative, and make it intrinsic into a positive. Incredible. It's just that simple. First, the Fed takes the government bonds with what the public does not buy and writes a check to Congress in exchange for them. There is no money to back up this check. These fiat dollars are created on the spot and for that purpose. By calling these bonds, they then transcribe to reserves. Again, it's a negative, it's nothing. But because they tag a name along with it, just like they tag along with the name dollar, now they're going to call it an asset because now it's a bond. They're going to put it on their books as an asset and lend it out to you at your labors. and your liability. Let's say something goes wrong and you can't pay back that mortgage. And as we talked about the word mortgage, death, pledge. But say you can't pay that back, what takes place? What takes place? You lose that asset. So you do all the labors, you take all the risk, you put up the assets you have to gain this entity, which is a negative entry and fiat, meaning nothing backing it up. You risk it all, they get all the gain. It's just like war. You do the bleeding, they do the profiting. Nothing's changed. Okay. So with that being said, folks, I don't want to go too much more because we are running on time. One of the things about this show is that time just seemed to go by awful quickly. But a quote from President Lincoln: "Government possessing power to create and issue currency and and credit as money, and enjoying the right to withdraw the currency and credit from circulation by taxation and otherwise, need not and should not borrow capital at interest. The privilege of creating and issuing money is not only the supreme prerogative of the government, but is the government's greatest creative opportunity." And what he's saying about that is, see, you got to understand that what Lincoln did, okay? Lincoln fought the bankers. Remember, we had his I won't do it verbatim, but to paraphrase it, it was, I have the Confederate Army at my front door, I have the international bankers at my back door. It is for the future of my nation. I fear the bankers the most. And that was what happened with Lincoln. Lincoln issued greenbacks. What he actually did was he went to the Treasury and said, okay, the government is now going to issue its own currency, okay, and it's going to be based on the faith of the American government, but what the linchpin was that this is the only thing we're going to accept for payment of taxes. So everybody went to it, and the bankers were losing control. Look what happened to Lincoln. Look what happened to John F. Kennedy. You want my honest opinion, folks, John F. Kennedy was the last president this country had that was actually looking out for the common good and the future of his nation. When he started issuing silver certificates, and we showed one last 2 weeks ago, I think it was, okay, and the number one, the American people were going to become aware of what they were using for money and what it was not, and number two, the bankers were going to lose control of the issuing power, okay? That is why months later, JFK died, I want to say mysteriously. Yeah, he was shot in public, but everybody in my generation and anyone who's done any research on it understands that Lee Harvey Oswald did not shoot JFK. Okay, Lee Harvey Oswald was not physically capable of making the shots that were made. Okay, the Raputa film. When you watch that, you know, obviously more than one shot being fired and from different angles and so forth, and all the witnesses. So who was behind this? It was the very same people that are controlling your pocketbook today. And the reason why was because of Executive Order 11110, and we ask you to look that up. And again, that was when he actually, you know, took control of the money powers for the American people. Okay, the Jekyll Island plan was very interesting, and one of the things that we don't have the time to get into right now, but one of the things that they really wanted to do was, when all this debt was to accumulate, how to shift the debt to the government IOUs, as they said earlier. Well, folks, who do you think backs the government IOUs? You and I. We are an asset to the United States government. And you may not believe this, but when you look up the word United States of America or United States or U.S. or any of that, it has three meanings, okay? One, it means the sovereign union of the 50 states. Two, it means the geographical area known as the United States, the territories, enclaves, the union, okay? And the third definition of the United States is the corporation. Yes, the United States of America is a corporation. That's what went insolvent. That's what went bankrupt to these shysters. Okay? Now, earlier we looked up persons, all right? And we looked up, you know, what a person is, and long and behold, we found out that in law, a person is a corporate entity. okay? If you take out your wallet or your purse and, I don't care what state you're from, take out your license and take a look at your license. You will see it is in uppercase black ink. When you get a letter from the government, court documents, whatever, uppercase black ink. That's because they are communicating to the nom de guerre, the corporate entity that you, through ignorance or desire, are representing. So when you go to court and the judge says, "Are you Thomas D'Ambra?" and I say, "Well, yes, I am." Well, that judge is not asking me whether, I was born with this name. This judge in his mind and in his language and through his deception is asking you, are you the corporate entity Thomas D'Ambra? Because when you look at the paper, it's all uppercase black ink. So do that sometime. I don't care what state you're from. Take out your driver's license and take a look at it. Uppercase black ink. Take out your old, if any of you veterans saved your draft notices, okay? Look at your draft notice, uppercase black ink. When you go to the post office, and I have one here, and I don't have the time to get it out right now, but I'll show it to you next week. Look at the registration for selective service. Big, bold letters. It's a trifold pamphlet. Big, bold letters right across the top of it. Guess what it says? Must use uppercase and black ink only. Why? They don't have a computer that can read in small red ink? Absolutely not. It's because they are communicating and contracting with you as a commercial entity, a nom de guerre. Please take the time to do that. I think you'll find it very, very interesting. Okay, so let's get into the person again. Municipal corporations possess two kinds of power: governmental and public. Okay, the proprietary and private. And in exercise of the former, a corporation is a municipal government, while as to the latter, it is a corporate, legal, individual, or person. Follow me here. Black's Fourth, page 409. It is a municipal government, while as to the later, it is a corporate, legal, individual, or person. So when that law enforcement officer, they're not peace officers anymore, they're law enforcement, and by the way, protect and serve, who are they protecting and serving? But that's for another show. But when this police officer says to you, license and registration, by the way, the word license comes from lycée, which is Napoleonic law, which literally means they're giving you permission to do something which would otherwise be unpermissionable. It would be illegal. Okay. The first license, folks, were granted out literally about 2,500 years ago, and the first license was actually a marriage license, and it was when people started to marry outside of their race. So that was the first. You had to get permission. If I say I wanted to marry a Native American woman, and I'm a Caucasian, I would have to get permission from the state and or church. No difference there either, folks. They're both there to do one thing, and that's to control you. But I have to get permission for them to do it, and that was the first license that was granted. So when this police officer asks you for your license and registration, he wants to make sure of two things. One, he doesn't know this, but the judge does. He wants to make sure that, number one, you're under his venue of law as a corporate entity, and number two, that your vehicle is under his venue of law as a corporate entity. And that's the reason why they asked for that. And real quick, if you want to get into why there's an insurance bond, was because a gentleman in Ohio back in the early 70s got in a car accident, and he went to the judge and said, "Your Honor, I merely have a certificate of title. I would recommend that you take this up with the true lease holders." Who would that be? The state of Ohio. So what they do? They had to put a bond between the liability to the true holders, okay, which is the state of Ohio or the state of Vermont or Rhode Island, whoever it may be, okay, and the person, the certificate, bearer use of, someone's allowing you to use it. Remember that from earlier shows? And that's why there's mandatory insurance in all but 2 states in the country, because there is a bond, a blockage, if you would, of going between the liability of the state and the individual operating the vehicle. Well, folks, at that being said, we didn't get into all we were hoping to, but there is next week, and we'll just continue from there. We thank you very, very much for watching. We hope it was a productive hour for you. And we do ask you, take out your driver's license, take a look at that name, and understand that you are operating as a commercial corporate entity. And remember, your government is your business. And we thank you for watching.